Hi, everybody. This is Steve Hargadon. It's Wednesday, August 5th, 2009. This is the second in a brand new series of interviews called Conversations.net. We're sure glad to have the group that's here. It must be early August. This is a small group for us, but we're glad to have you here. And if you're listening to the recording, thanks for downloading it. This is a fun night for me because I'm actually interviewing my brother. So we're going to leave our webcams on just for a minute so you can see what we look like. He's the handsome one in the beard. And
I wasn't going to say that.
Yeah, I know. You're humble. You're so humble. Okay, so before we start, I want to just make sure you're aware of a couple of events that we've got coming up. On August 12th next week, Dan Schauble on personal branding in the age of the Internet. August 18th, Howard Rheingold. August 25th, Tim Westergren from Pandora. This is actually a contact that Andy made for me. September 9th, Jane Nelson on Parenting 2.0, how to parent in the age of the Internet. September 15th, we're going to talk to Anne Galerin from Europe about the e-twinning program they have there for education. John C. Brown on September 22nd, Dennis Lipke on October 6th. And then still to be scheduled but committed, we're going to have a special on School 2.0, a PBS show on the future of student journalism. Edutopia's working with us to do a show on educational town hall meetings, bringing the whole community together to talk about schooling on a local level, and lots of other fun stuff. Okay, the Conversations.net is in part sponsored by Learn Central, a new social network for educators that I'm the community manager for. I want to encourage you to go to learncentral.org, a Facebook-like environment, Facebook-like in scope, helping you find other educators with similar interests, with Illuminate baked into the product. A lot of fun to be able to use Illuminate with a free public Illuminate webinar room, so if you've ever wanted to start your own webinar, there's a way to do it. And also with a fairly robust content sharing piece. So lots of fun there. Please visit learncentral.org and support us in that effort. If this is your first time in Illuminate, I want to make sure that you're aware of some of the tools here. On the top left, you're going to see a participant window. You can actually mouse over someone who's there, and if they put contact information, it will show up. It will also show you receiving the mic. If you raise your hand and want to use the microphone, you'll see a little mic icon show up for yourself. Below that window is an icon with a hand and a green arrow up. If you click on that, that's a way of raising your hand. And it would be good if you want to ask Andy a question. That's how you would do it. Please feel free to use that, especially with a group of this size. But you don't need to wait for the Q&A. We'd welcome you asking a question at any time. Next to that hand-raising icon are 4 smaller emoticons: smiley face, clapping hand, confusion, or thumbs down. You can use those as well. The chat area is awfully small. If you decide you want to look at chat in greater detail, go up to View, Layouts, and select the wide layout. That's my preferred layout, although it doesn't default to that, but it gives you a little bit bigger view of the chat. You can send private chats to other people in the room. The drop-down box for doing that, but know that Andy and I will both see those. They're not fully private. Yeah. So say nice things. And then to the right, where you see the quick orientation, is our whiteboard, and I'm going to give you a chance right now to use the whiteboard by giving you whiteboard permissions. You'll see a wand with a red star at the end. If you click on that and then click on the map, you can let us know where you're listening from. So I don't know if that Alaska was intentional, but if you're coming in from Alaska, please feel free to shout out in the chat. And we'll move forward. We'll do a United States map. If you are in the U.S., you go ahead and click again on this map. Okay, well, California and eastern and western Pennsylvania, we rock tonight. Okay, so this really is fun for me, Andy. I'm going to go ahead and turn the webcam off so it's not distracting. This is a pretty rich environment, and the webcam can sometimes be just a little bit too much. Sure fun to have you here, Andy. A lot of fun for me because I think a lot of the conversations that are taking place now tend to actually cross some different boundaries and bring the two of us into what I think are pretty fascinating discussions, and maybe in some ways reflective of this change that's taking place. It could be described with some language that you use. You've been on kind of a blog tear recently. So would you tell us a little bit about your background and why you seem to be sort of uniquely positioned right now to be talking about some of the things you're talking about?
Okay. I'm not going to lay claim to be uniquely positioned to talk about what I'm talking about, but I'm certainly passionate enough to talk about it. But my background is essentially I was originally trained as an engineer, mechanical engineer, undergrad and master's, and then but engaged in innovation and in particular product design. So I went and I worked in the Silicon Valley for a while, sort of interning at IDEO, product development, and then over to Apple Computer, doing product development and designing a few of the products that came out in the early 90s. And then got an itch to go back into education and and returned to Stanford to do my PhD in the industrial engineering group, which was actually not as crazy as it seemed, in the sense that that was the place where people studied organizational behavior, issues around innovation and creativity in engineering settings, which is what I was interested in. So I finished a PhD studying the process of innovation in companies, and came out and began to teach at a business school. I think, to make what is, sort of a 20-year trek, a 3-minute background, I essentially, enjoyed studying innovation as a process, looking at it, wrote my book around it, and around the research I had done through the dissertation and afterwards. But began to realize more and more that, in fact, most of the innovation literature was heavily biased towards a fascination with having good ideas. How do people come up with great ideas? How did they grow up so that they could come up with great ideas? How often do they nap? How do they spend their days? How do you manage them effectively so they can come up with great ideas? And very little attention was paid to the things people do after they have a great idea, and that actually makes that idea something worth pursuing, adopting, joining, sticking around with, and investing in, and other things like that. So rather quickly after having sort of written a little bit about how people came up with ideas, I began to be really dissatisfied with the relative balance and focus between having a good idea and doing the things you need to do to make that idea accepted by others. And that's when I started to focus more on what essentially became the entrepreneurial side of innovation, the side that begins with a great idea and watches what people do to make that a success. A lot of, you can talk about it in terms of organizational change management, or new firm formation and startup cultures and activities. But it all had a similar essence, which is, what do people do to make ideas great after they've had them? And so I spent the next, now almost 10 years really looking at that and trying to understand what it is. And the particular setting I'm in makes it easy for me to focus on scientists and engineers in university settings and what they do to move their ideas that they've developed out of the laboratory and into the market. And so a lot of my work now has focused on that as what I think is sort of a very nice, pure form of this challenge. And so, I think bluntly put, cutting to the chase, the notion that that if you build a better mousetrap, the world will be the path to your door is wrong. And, I've said this many times now, but it's wrong for a couple reasons. The first is that Ralph Waldo Emerson never actually said those words. He said, if you sell better wood or better grain or a bigger pig, people will buy from you instead. Right? You'll find a hard-beaten road by your door. And it was about 7 years after he died that a journalist changed the words around and made it a little bit more exciting. But the other reason it's wrong is there's a wonderful study by a guy, Jack Hope, who looked at the patent records. And since we started recording patents for mousetraps in 1828, there have been over 4,400 patented. of those, only 24 have ever made any money, and of those, there are really only 2 dominant designs. So the simple story is, in fact, that if you build a better mousetrap, the odds are heavily against anything happening. And I think that's probably roughly similar statistics if you've developed some interesting and publishable research in a lab somewhere in the university system in the U.S. Odds are pretty good that not much happened to it. It might have been an article, but I doubt any, but odds again are that industry never picked it up, and it really didn't have the impact it could have had on society that certainly the researchers would have hoped for. So a lot of my time has now been looking at what do people need to do to move their ideas out and get them accepted by the larger audience that they're hoping to have an impact on. So I think if you're talking about my most recent blog rant, Steve, it's been a lot of a focus on moving science out of the laboratory, and particularly how that's become a very political issue these days with the energy innovation plan, Obama's $150 billion effort to essentially fund a new generation of technology, energy technology revolutions, and whether or not that's being spent wisely from an understanding of how innovation takes place and how ideas move out of the laboratory. It was a long rant, but I'm going to stop there and let you so bring me back on course.
No, I think it's been really interesting to watch you address specifically some of the ways in which the current policies or ideas around how you bring innovation forward don't necessarily mesh with what we actually have seen in the past as to how that happens, and how specifically with a lot of money being poured into a lot of things right now, and specifically related to energy policy, you're able to see patterns because of your work.
And I think what's one of the things that I'm involved in and seeing a lot is that the policy debate right now is being driven in many ways by 2 very interested parties. On the one hand, you've got industry and its lobbyists, and if you look at the sort of the percentage increase in lobbying from the energy sector and from the healthcare sector these days, you see that obviously they're very active in trying to shape the administration's ideas of how to spend the money that they're thinking of spending. But on the other hand, in the energy sector, you've got on the other side scientists and their beliefs about how the money should be spent. $150 billion is a lot of money, and and the idea of how should you spend that to move the U.S. off its dependency on carbon-based fuels, oil, natural gas, and what's the right way to move us forward? So you've got, on the one hand, lobbyists who would say, well, we need to fund industry to develop new technologies and deploy them. And you've got folks like GE who want to get money to do turbines, or their wind turbines, or their cleaner coal. And you've got, on the other hand, scientists who are saying, no, none of those will get us where we need. We need fundamental investments in new basic research. And if you spend money on deploying existing technologies, that's money not spent on us in our fundamental research. So unfortunately, the debate has been framed very clearly by 2 very interested parties around what I think is, in fact, the wrong language and the wrong notion, which is that there is such a thing as basic research leading to applied research, leading to deployment or development, demonstration, and deployment of new technology. And that innovation, in fact, proceeds in that fashion, moving from basic research through the pipeline and coming out as something to demonstrate and deploy. And so the debate right now rages between 2 people who are on either side of the spectrum, but both of which stand to gain a lot by winning. I spoke about this briefly, but it reminds me of the old story of the elephant and the blind men, who the blind men, they're blind scholars who head down to learn what an elephant is, and they both arrive at a different part of the elephant. One feels a tusk and says the elephant's like a spear. The other feels a leg and says the elephant's like a tree. One feels the body and says it's like a cauldron, and the other feels the ear and says it's like a wicker basket. And then they proceed to argue for the next foreseeable future while Buddha laughs, because they're so sure that they know the whole by having seen their part. And I think it's an instructive parable, again, for thinking about things like innovation, which are very complicated processes, and those people who would argue that one aspect of them needs to be funded against all the others.
So I'd like to sort of direct us toward, this idea, at least tonight, of talking about, the impact of the internet on innovation. And so I'm wondering if it would be an oversimplification of that parable to say that the ability of two or more of those blind men to actually transfer ideas from each other would lead to a greater understanding of the elephant. Is that a decent segue into some of your thoughts and ideas from how breakthroughs happen?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, in other words, the challenge really does become, how do you get those blind men sharing what they know and talking about it in a way that gets them away from being pitted against one another and having their scholarly reputations be a zero-sum game where one is right and the other is wrong. To your point in your segue, a lot of the research I have done on innovation has focused on how little novelty is actually the motive force behind most of the innovations we know. And in other words, what really has made many of the things that we would look to as profound innovations is actually not that they were new ideas. In fact, in many cases, those ideas existed for decades, if not longer. But rather that somebody came along and took these existing ideas and put them together in a new way that somehow met the market need better and was able to scale up and have a dramatic impact quickly. Ford didn't invent the automobile. He did mass production, but really, when you look at mass production, he didn't invent most of the elements of it. He happened to have the wisdom of going out and finding the people who had done interchangeable parts and machine tools in other industries and brought them in to build his car factory. And then he went down and he watched the meat packing plant and brought back the idea of the assembly line. And he did, in many ways, he even said it, that his ideas were not new, they were new combinations. And in fact, if he had tried to do anything new, it would have failed, because he really did depend on all of the technologies and the expertise that had developed in the different markets. He depended on those to be able to put together a system that would work at a large scale immediately. And we find the same thing when you look at Edison and the light bulb. It was a 30-year-old technology by the time Edison got to it, but he figured out a way to put it together in a business model that the mass market would adopt. Yeah, so go ahead.
No. Well, I was going to say, so I look at a lot of the phrases that you use in how breakthroughs happen: bridging, range, building community, technology brokering, recombinant innovation. And I'm wondering to what degree these get impacted by the incredible communication capabilities of the internet.
So that's okay. So yeah, just to come back to that, once you accept the notion that innovations really are driven by the new combination of old ideas that they represent, yeah, you get into recognizing that in fact innovation is a networking process more than it is an individual sort of brainstorming ideation process. And it's the ability to put these ideas together and then put the new combinations together with other people, and sort of building new bridges across markets or across ideas really become the core activities. You begin to look at then why somebody is innovative, and instead of asking what made them such a wacky person, you begin to ask, what is it about their network that gave them insights and connections to the people and the ideas that they needed and they brought together? And I think the internet is an incredible tool for that, because now all of a sudden we have access, if we're curious enough, we have access to an enormous number of ideas that are already out there, and we can find them, and they flow much more easily as a result. I think it reminds me of a wonderful printed manual that came up in the Middle Ages called the Encyclopédie, which included sketches. It was a block prints, but it included sketches of all of the major technologies of the day: water wheels, windmills, drills, and by including those as sketches and then printing up and passing it around, then anybody anywhere could look at the book, figure out these machines. They were fairly simple, and build their own. And I think that's certainly the early days of the web, where people were looking at other people's pages, looking at the code, and building their own and improving on it slightly, and then somebody else would come along and do the same. And I think more subtly, that's what we're all now doing. We have the ability to find other people who are interested in the same things we're interested in, who are doing the same things, and seeing how it is they're doing it, and using those ideas that they've developed to improve what we do. So on the one hand, the internet is creating a single market in which we're all competing, but on the other hand, it's also bringing together so many of us that it gives us all opportunities to learn what new ways we can do things.
So I'm thinking as well, not only about the expansion of connections and ideas and finding others and building community, but I'm also thinking of the decreased cost in organizing and experimenting, almost sort of the failure is free model. And I'm wondering, does this draw innovation down a level? Meaning, does it, I think of all of the people I know who have created something that's made a difference, say, for educational technology, whether it's a social network or a website or a interview series or a conference or whatever it is. Do these trends actually allow for more innovation within a longer tail? Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think the tools of production have come down a level. We can all afford to do much more than we could have done 10 years ago, let alone 20. So now many of us are capable of pulling new ideas together, old ideas together in new ways, and putting them out, whether that's creating a new technology or, writing a new blog post, that just publishing, for that matter. So I think that the internet as a technology has allowed, obviously, it sort of democratized the tools of production in a nice way. In particular areas, in those areas where IT can make a difference. I think it's also given a lot of power to people to see what's possible in other places. But I think it's important to recognize the limitation. Information and communication technologies like the internet, like the personal computer, and all that we are doing with them now, are good at allowing us to do some things, but not necessarily everything. And so there still comes a time when I'm going to make an assumption here that when a teacher comes up with a great idea for a new way of including technology in their teaching of a subject or in the school, and they can put together a website and they can pull in the tools for a wiki and everything all very easily, but they still have to go back to the principal and the other teachers, and in the time-honored tradition, try and figure out what's in it for them, try and convince them that this is good for them, not bad, and do the boots on the ground network building that encourages them to participate, to get involved, or at least to accept this new innovation in their school. So I think we're left with the tools allow us to create things, but they don't always necessarily they don't solve the whole problem.
I agree, and at the same time, I'm intrigued by the degree to which a lot of the innovation I see taking place, number one, is happening as thought innovation, or non-tangible or physical innovation, the creation of something that's internet-based, and number two, the degree to which it cuts across or doesn't even touch traditional organizational structure, like the teacher who creates her own community around her subject area, in which there's really no formal relationship to her employer, but she feels better and is doing something of good in the same way that somebody writing an article for Wikipedia would.
Right. Which is, and I don't think we should probably even bother trying to compare the value of those activities. But it is interesting. I mean, there's an interesting distinction in innovation between brownfields and greenfields, and it's right back to the old days of having a factory and trying to introduce a revolutionary new process for it. I'll jump into sort of tangible detail on this one. But Ford in mass production, originally factories of the turn of the century, the end of the 19th century, if you built a factory, you built a steam engine. And then, because that was the power that you would use to build a factory, and you built a steam engine, and then you built an entire factory around that steam engine. And you built the biggest steam engine you thought you could possibly need because you'd never be able to go back and replace it. And then you built the factory coming off it using the steam engine. And at the turn of that century, and Ford was one of the first to take advantage of it, along came the electric motor, which allowed you to design a factory and simply put electric motors wherever you needed them. And this sort of highlights the conundrum, which is if you're going to innovate, a brownfield is a field with, sort of that's brown already, that has a factory in place. A greenfield is new and doesn't have anything built. It's a meadow. And people all over are faced with the decision, well, should I close this factory down and try and fix it and replace the steam engine with electric motors, but still have a factory that was designed for the wrong purpose? Or should I just move out of town, find a greenfield somewhere, and build a whole new factory that's designed for exactly the way I want to do things? And today we face that same problem. Should that person who's building a community outside of her school and across the country spend her effort in a greenfield trying to develop this entirely new community in an entirely new medium, or in the brownfield of trying to fix her school? And there's no right answer. There's simply that challenge, and it will exist. But I think I think one of the biggest issues we've got is the internet and a lot of these information communication technologies are creating new markets, and we're finding new ways of doing wholly new things, but we're not necessarily fixing the old ways. These are just new. So I'll leave it for there and see what reaction you got.
So greenfield, brownfield is probably a really good way of talking about education. I've been doing interviews on educational technology for 4 years now, and we've never talked about greenfields or brownfields, and we've probably talked about it in other terms, but I'm wondering, to what degree is this conversation with you, a professor at UC Davis, thinking about innovation, and me and our small audience tonight, but if we can project to the larger ed tech audience, to what degree are we actually reflecting the kind of bridging that potentially leads to innovation, or even thinking differently?
Yeah, it's here's where I think it's probably got a lot of value. On the one hand, there are opportunities for you guys in what you're doing, especially Steve, to have people share their best practices and their solutions that they've experienced, and allow other people to learn from them. I think not to be underestimated, though, is the power of finding a community of like-minded individuals outside of your existing sort of network, whether that's a school or a district or something else, that provides you with the motivation, the interest, the encouragement, and and emotional support to actually make a change in what you're doing, or in what and try and make a change in the system around you. One of the problems with a focus on the great idea in innovation is you end up focusing on the person who had that great idea, the individual genius, and as a result, you don't pay attention to, you don't recognize just how important most of those innovations, just how important was a small community of like-minded individuals to most of those innovations. And you wouldn't realize that Edison had a sort of a lifelong business partner, Charles Batchelor, with whom he shared the royalties on his patents 50-50 during his most prolific periods. You wouldn't realize that because all the books care about are Edison, but in fact he worked alongside a small group of people who were critical to the ideas that came out of his efforts and their efforts. Not to be flip, but Lennon and McCartney were a great team. Elvis Presley probably wouldn't have been anything without Sam Phillips, his producer. And so you can start to look back, and Steve Jobs, well, originally it was Wozniak, but he was too shy to even talk about his first design for the Apple computer. And along came Steve Jobs, and the two of them together built the company, and it wouldn't have existed without either of them. But I think one of the important things of these kinds of communities is, in fact, that very support that most people who are interested in change have a hard time finding. So
this is really fascinating for me because, as soon as you say that, I want to show you Classroom 2.0 or some of the things that we're starting to do with states, where some states that have very geographically dispersed teachers are starting social networks so that those educators actually have colleagues or that collegial relationship. And I'm wondering if, in fact, I'm overestimating the value of this, or if it, in fact, does fit with your perceptions that this kind of community building will have a tremendous impact potentially on the ability of these educators to collaborate together and to come up with things that prior to the internet just would not have been possible.
I think we're in agreement probably, because what I know, just having talked with you for these last few years about these programs, it really is a critical. The examples go on and on. I think I talk about one in my book about the Impressionists, Monet and Gauguin and Renoir and others, who really did work side by side, and there was the importance of their small, tight-knit group of people in going against the existing art establishment. It was in fact what made the difference. And there was a moment where Monet was looking at an old painting and he couldn't tell whether it was his or, I think it was Renoir's, whether it was his or Renoir's, because they had painted the same scene side by side that day and exploring the same techniques. And it wasn't until Impressionism was sort of accepted that they began to split apart from each other and compete with each other. But in the beginning, they couldn't have succeeded without working together. And really, sort of great quotes about how one person would discard an idea and another would pick it up and run with it. That really, I think, is crucial to understanding how change really happens.
That's highly encouraging to me. I think in part because of my experiences with EduBloggerCon, which is this all-day conference we've now held for 3 years, where people get together who had never met each other before, but were part of the educational technology blogging community. And I'm feeling as though a very similar relationship exists, the kind of experimentation together, the sharing of ideas, and the give and take. And to me, that's actually highly encouraging. It feels very much like you've just validated this amazing process of exploring that's been taking place.
Well, that would be nice. I would hope so. I think that's it's certainly been one of my missions to push that the value of that small group of people, not in executing ideas, which is important too, but even in developing the ideas themselves and coming together. I wrote a paper on what essentially creative collectives, or the notion that in fact groups working together are responsible for more than we think in terms of developing ideas. So it's a really important point that I would certainly push as well. But to the extent that you can find people who are interested in a subject and give them the tools to move forward productively, each in their individual not to be too dramatic, but each in their individual battles, know that they're not alone. It's really important.
So the analogy I've been using lately is the combination lock, and I've been using it with regard to social media, where you kind of have to wait for the tumblers to fall into place for the lock to open, and that you can't really force that. That authentic social media use is about letting those tumblers fall into place, whereas a lot of companies appear to be wanting to just take the marketing value of social media and just rip the door open. So I'm wondering if we think about those tumblers falling into place as being necessary for innovation, and one is the idea and another is the network and some of these things you're talking about. If we think about engaged educators who are exploring the territories of the internet, who are coming up with great practices, what might be the next tumblers that would need to fall into place for large systemic change to take place in education?
Boy. So, there are sort of technical tumblers, there are social tumblers, all of these, we can talk about the technical tumblers that need to fall into place, and again, it's often specific to whatever solution you're trying to move forward with. But then there's also the social tumblers. Worst case, do we need to wait until a new generation of people who are more comfortable working with computers, or the generation after that are more comfortable working, with the internet? That may be, that's sort of the worst case tumbler, is that you simply have to wait till the new generation that's comfortable with these technologies comes into power. But ideally, how do you jumpstart it before then? And that's a really challenging question. I think in looking at how does innovation literature try and understand how do you get ideas to diffuse faster than that? It's actually got a surprisingly counterintuitive recommendation, which is most of a lot of the efforts in innovation are driven towards creating something that's truly revolutionary, and it's going to change the way everybody behaves. But really, what comes out is like the successful foothold, the technology that really finally does get a foothold, the revolutionary technology, actually comes in looking very much like the technology that it's replacing. And the best example was Edison's light bulb. Almost everything he did to the design of the light bulb was to try and make it look and act more like gas lamps and less like the revolutionary lighting technology. He had a 40-watt bulb burning in his lab, and he launched with a 13-watt bulb because the gas light was about 12 watts, and he didn't want to come in with a glaring light. What we think, 40 watts, we think is mild, but at the time when you're used to 12 watts, that was a shocker. One of his biggest challenges was the ability to turn on and off an electric light, which prior to Edison you really couldn't do. You turned off the entire system. But that's how gas lamps work, so he did that. And if we look forward, we've been trying to produce electric vehicles for a long time, and along comes the Prius, and one of their first sort of pitches is, look, Mom, no plug. It's not an electric car. It's just like your gas car. You don't need to worry. You've always got gas in the tank. As long as you keep it filled up, it'll be just like your gasoline car. You don't need to pay attention to the electric side of it. And for the first 5 or so years of any new technology, that's it's easier to get it accepted by making it look like old technologies, and then it will evolve as people begin to use it. And that's what we're seeing with the Prius. What you're finding is now Prius owners are getting annoyed that they have to fill it up at all. If they're only driving around town, why should they have to fill up their gas tank? How can they drive it to keep the electric motor going and the gas engine off? And so people adapt quickly once it's in their hands. But to get it in their hands, they need to really understand how it helps them do what they've always done. So coming back then to thinking about social media in schools, how do you domesticate the revolution? How do you introduce it into existing systems in a way that makes that solves their current, the current problems of the current people in power. And let it evolve in use from there. But if it doesn't do it that way, it may never get in the first place, or it may have to wait for that generation.
So how does Clayton Christensen's disruptive innovation model factor into this? Because it sounds like we're talking about the need for adoption and for it to look like the technology that it's replacing. But are there times when something doesn't look like what it's replacing and it just sort of wholesale wipes out a previous way of doing things?
Well, that's a difficult thing because, the model's based on a number of different ideas in different industries. The original study came out of looking at disk drives, but in fact, if you take a look at the data, the new disk drive form factors were actually being used in very different products. Along come the portable computers with smaller disk drives, and in the end, when all the dust settled, some of the major corporations who were building disk drives at the beginning were still there building them at the end. So I think it's a challenge. The disruptive innovation side is good at when you're an existing manufacturer looking at your product and then looking at a competing technology that does what your product does, not as well in some ways, but ultimately better in others. And why is it that you're going to have a hard time making the switch to producing and selling what is inherently and ultimately the next platform? It doesn't. It's not about getting your technology adopted so much as abandoning your technology and you adopting something else. So for schools, so it's thinking about your product. So if you talk about disruptive innovation in education, what's the product and what's the disruptive product that's coming in that's going to do it differently or better? That's a question back to, I suppose.
Well, so I think the easy answer to that, and maybe not the fullest one, would be online learning. And the adopting groups being potentially the underserved populations, the kids who dropped out of schools or who are not being served by the current school system, where you're seeing homeschoolers like the K-12 group, or students who are high risk, at risk, out of school, who are joining organizations that do get them a high school degree. Seems like that's where the adoption's taking place, and at least if we're looking at online learning.
Okay, I get it. That helps a lot. If you look at the university level, Phoenix, DeVry, there's a lot of programs out there now that are doing online learning and competing with universities and particularly sort of continuing ed programs at universities. That's a real issue. How do we, and I think most universities are trying to understand how can we bring that kind of online learning into the program. Okay, so I think I get that sense better. And what you're really looking at is, can we accept that it's not as good in some ways, but so much better in other ways that maybe if we simply changed our criteria, we'd be better off. I don't know. From that perspective, ultimately that still boils down to more of a social and political challenge than a technical one. Online learning
which maybe I think has been a lot of your point.
Yeah, it's how. So let's say you've decided that online learning is critical. What do you do to what do you do to get your administration or your university or your K-12, your school to embrace it or at least experiment with it? Yeah. I say good luck, because no matter how great the technology is, it's still going to be a process of building a coalition inside the school, almost one person at a time, that creates the momentum for that change. I think figuring out a way to reframe that change so that it highlights the value to people in allowing them to do the jobs they already have somehow better.
I think that actually may apply more particularly to the idea of using social media in schools, meaning those of us who are highly involved in social media feel like our own personal learning has been reinvigorated, jump-started. The teachers who are trying to do that in their own schools probably face that particular challenge of needing to provide something of value to those who are decision makers. And so my guess is that's very apropos to what you're talking about in terms of building that that basis for seeing it as a positive change.
Now, now the other piece that we're seeing, and I don't know how this applies in schools, is how do you on the individual level, you can show how that's helpful in terms of giving, the social media giving teachers new tools and new communities to work with and reinvigorate. But the larger questions are, how does a school get credit for a student taught through distance ed? And now you're cutting to the core of state funding and school funding and budgets and challenges there.
So we've only got a little over 10 minutes left. So there's another topic I wanted to bring us to, and so I think I'm comfortable leaving that for the moment, if that's okay with you. Can we shift gears slightly? Okay, so I'm really interested in the potential for an entrepreneurial renaissance because of the internet. So if you were to look at the internet in terms of other sort of historically significant advances, the printing press or the telegraph, what's your personal sense of the impact the internet's going to have?
Oh, I think it's at least equal to, if not greater than, almost all of them, in the sense that it's such a profound communications paradigm platform. The thing about it is it's democratically available. Obviously, 2/3 of the world population is on subsistence farming, so we don't want to make the claim that the internet will make everybody's life better in the next 5 years. But I do think it has profound implications. I push to think about it in terms of entrepreneurship. The internet is both a new platform, a new market on which people can create things and sell things. But it's also a resource for people who are engaging in traditional innovation efforts. So that's where the social media and the support for teachers is great, because they still have to go back, and the innovations are still in the classroom. And they might bring the internet in, but the innovation really is, and the innovation effort and challenge really is in getting that particular school to accept that practice or that new computer lab or that new way of doing things. And and so the internet becomes a supporting role there, whereas we've got students who created iPhone applications or games. They left and they didn't have a job, so they created they got together and they created an iPhone game and made a surprising amount of money for very little investment. Excuse me. And in that way, the internet is simply a new market. And it still remains, so 10 years later on the internet and 20 years later in the PC world, a Greenfield in which people are, rushing out and staking claim to a new offering. And that's very different, so it has two very different opportunities. One to support old innovation, and the other is to, create the space for new innovation. So that's why I think it's probably bigger than anything else.
So are you actually, in your work with entrepreneurship, seeing a sense that that entrepreneurship is growing significantly?
Yes, it is. It's growing significantly, but again, I think it's actually growing. The other thing that the internet is doing is shifting the flow of resources away from the more challenging innovations that are in the bricks and mortar, the brownfields, and towards the innovations that are quick and relatively low cost, around the internet, around new software and new offerings online. This is a little bit like the concern we have. So many smart people went to Wall Street in the last 15 years to make so much money, and that they got their PhDs in some engineering program and then went to Wall Street to use that experience to create new financial models that didn't work out very well. What would have happened if they had all gone back, stayed in engineering? We're getting a generation of people who are entrepreneurs, but they're building new products on the internet and leaving behind, well, what about the rest of life that still has to take place, and what would happen if that energy went to that, to fixing those old ways? So I don't know. I think it's a mixed blessing there. We're certainly getting a lot more things online, and online's bringing us a lot more, but it's also distracting us from still the real problems. Now we're getting into I'll stop there. I'll get off that soapbox for a second.
Well, so we've only got a few more minutes. If you have a question for Andy, please feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat. Andy, I'm interested in what you're working on right now. I know you're working on ideas around networking. Do you want to describe that at all?
Yeah, well, there's a couple things going on, but particularly around, again, shifting this focus and innovation towards innovation as a process of networking, really as a process of building new networks that didn't exist before. I think one of the fundamental sort of pieces of advice I certainly give to entrepreneurs, anybody looking to make change happen, is that the network is the innovation. If you're starting with brand new ideas, new technology that have never been done before, you've got a real challenge, and you're certainly not going to have an impact for a while. But if you can find new ways of using old ideas, the real challenge becomes, how can you create the network that will get these ideas accepted and get them accepted in just the right way? Some good examples of that more recently, the iPhone, or forget the iPhone, the iPod itself. Apple didn't invent the MP3 player. It was about the 13th MP3 player on the market. But what they saw was an opportunity to bring their network that they had already to bear on that product, and then build an even better network around it. So their network was the iTunes music software and the Macintosh operating system, sort of a seamless interface. But then they realized that if they played their cards right, and they did, they could get the record labels involved and be the first to enable online sort of legitimate digital music sales. And that brought value to the people who bought the first iPod. And then after that, getting movies and photos and video and internet all into the system, the product. They really built a better network around MP3 players than anybody else did. And and it's a really powerful lesson to learn, because it shifts the notion to, okay, assume a dozen other people have the same idea as you do. The one that's going to succeed is going to be the one with the better relationships. It's the one who's got the connections, who has the ear of the people in power, or who has that first customer who cares deeply about it, and and is able to build a set of relationships around their idea faster than the others. And I think what you can really see when you watch innovation unfold is that the best technological solution really doesn't mean much without the right network around it to move it forward. And I think that's so now all of a sudden, it's I'm looking at Mary Beth. I think you're absolutely right. It's not what you know, it's who you know. But it's who you know and how well you know them. Because in fact, what you're going to ask them to do is something that they've never done before. So how do you bring people together in a way that changes their behavior and advances your agenda? How do you get the record labels to finally concede and sell their music online through your iTunes music store? And that's the real creative, the sort of the real creative side of the process, is figuring out the ways in which you can put 5 people together in a room that wouldn't have ordinarily gotten together to advance an agenda that they didn't know they had, and all somehow see that it's in their best interest and get something out of it. And then, and ultimately that becomes that was Edison's ability to get J.P. Morgan and other investors to buy into the system, to get the New York City to allow him to bury his lines underground, to get the first set of customers to allow him to build a demonstration project. Those were the real, that's the real challenge in innovation.
Hey, Andy, it's always really fun to talk to you. We're about 4 minutes away, and there's another webinar coming online at the top of the hour. So I think let's finish there.
Okay.
And part of what we've been able to do tonight, I'm clapping for you, is to actually record and hold online the kind of conversations that I really enjoy having with you. And so, I really appreciate your coming on tonight and talking about it. I think it's a lot of food for thought for me related specifically to education, but also just in terms of innovation and the internet. And my own kind of wondering, you said something recently, I'm trying to remember if it was on the that interview that was in the New York Times. You said something like, innovation is rational in retrospect. Mm-hmm. And I'm very curious to see how we're going to look back at this period of time and what kind of rationality we'll see that's hard for us to decipher right now, but which will become clear later. So thanks for doing this tonight.
Well, thank you, Steve. I hope I made some sense. It's certainly fun.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're gonna pause there. I'm actually going to turn the recorder off because of those of you who are here for the Sue Waters RSS deal. Durf is asking, when is Andy's next Illuminate? So Andy, the next time you want to hold a session like this, it doesn't even have to be with me moderating, but if you have something you're interested in talking about, feel free to contact me and I'll show you how to do it, and we'll have you up and running in Illuminate in no time. Thanks to Illuminate for providing the space. Thanks to you for coming. Please do visit Learn Central. Please do look at our schedule. I'm going to go back just briefly to our schedule of upcoming events, just to remind you we have some fun things coming up. Thanks for attending. Thanks, Andy, and we'll see you in the near future.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Steve.